His son hadn't taken a single step in 3 years until I touched his feet. I didn't believe the voice on the phone at first. People say desperate things when they're out of options. And I'd heard them all. Miracle cures. Last chances. Promises wrapped in money that sounded too big to be real. But this one was different. The caller didn't beg. He didn't explain. He just gave me an address and said, "Be ready at midnight." Then he hung up. I should have said no. I had just finished a 16-hour shift at a small clinic in Queens, my legs aching, my eyes burning from fluorescent lights and paperwork that never ended. My bank account was down to double digits. Rent was 3 days late. Again. And still something about the silence in that man's voice stayed with me. Not cold. Not angry. Just final. Like he wasn't used to being questioned. Like the world moved when he spoke. I told myself I was only going for the money. That was the safe answer. The logical one. I grabbed my bag, my worn sneakers squeaking against the tile as I left my apartment, and called a rideshare because my car had been making a sound I couldn't afford to fix. The driver didn't say much. Just glanced at the address, then at me, like he wanted to ask something but thought better of it. The city changed as we drove. Queens faded into bridges and lights, then into long stretches of quiet roads lined with tall iron gates and trees that blocked out the sky. The kind of neighborhoods you only see from a distance. The kind where people don't ask questions because they already know the answers would cost too much. We stopped in front of a gate that looked like it belonged to a private estate, not a home. 12 feet high, black steel, cameras mounted at every angle. Before I could even reach for the door handle, the gates opened on their own. No sound, just movement, like the place had been expecting me. My chest tightened. I almost told the driver to turn around. Almost. But I didn't. The car rolled forward, tires crunching softly over a gravel driveway that curved through perfectly trimmed lawns and trees spaced too precisely to be natural. The house, no, the mansion, came into view slowly, rising out of the darkness. Like something carved from shadow and stone. Lights glowed from inside, warm but distant, like they belonged to a world I wasn't part of. The car stopped. The driver cleared his throat. "You want me to wait?" I shook my head before I could think. No, my voice sounded smaller than I expected. I stepped out into the cold night air, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the car drove off, leaving me alone in a place that felt too quiet, too controlled. The front door opened before I could knock. A man in a black suit stood there, expression unreadable, posture straight like he'd been standing there for hours. "Miss Carter," he said, like he already knew exactly who I was. Not a question. Never question. I nodded. He stepped aside. This way. I followed him inside, my footsteps echoing softly against marble floors that reflected the chandelier light above like glass. Everything was spotless. Perfect. Controlled. Even the air felt different, cool, measured, like it didn't belong to anyone but the house itself. We walked down a long hallway lined with doors I didn't dare look into. At the end, he stopped. The boy's inside. His hand rested on the handle, but he didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked at me for the first time, really looked. Not judging, not curious, just assessing. "No one has helped him," he added quietly. "Not in 3 years." My throat tightened. 3 years. I reached for the door before I could overthink it. My fingers brushed the handle. Cold. Heavy. Final. And for the first time since I got the call, I wasn't thinking about the money anymore. I pushed the door open slowly, expecting something dramatic, something loud, something that would match the weight of everything I just walked into, but the room was quiet, almost painfully quiet, the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, like you were interrupting something fragile just by existing. And there he was, sitting near the far wall on a low chair that looked too small for the space, a boy, maybe 7 years old, thin but not weak, pale, but not sick, just still, completely still, his feet bare against the polished wood floor, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the walls like he was, looking at something only he could see. And for a second, I did not move. I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me, letting him feel me before I spoke, because children like this, they always knew when you rushed. They always knew when you tried too hard, and the man behind me did not follow. The door closed softly, leaving me alone with the boy, and whatever had taken him away from the world 3 years ago. I took a step forward. Slow, careful, the way you approach something that might disappear if you move too fast. Hi, I said quietly, my voice softer than I expected, softer than I had used all day, and there was no reaction, not even a flicker, not even a shift in his breathing, nothing. I waited, counted in my head, 1, 2, 3, the way I always did, giving space, giving time, but still nothing. I moved closer, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see the details now. The way his toes curled slightly inward, the faint tension in his ankles, not physical, not exactly. Something else, something held, something locked. I'd seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize it. Bodies that could move, but did not. Not because they could not, but because something inside refused to let them. I crouched down slowly, lowering myself to his level instead of towering over him, placing my bag gently on the floor, making sure every movement was visible, predictable, safe. My name is Emily, I said, keeping my tone steady, not too bright, not too heavy, just present. I am here to help you. And still, nothing, but this time I noticed something small, something easy to miss if you were not looking for it. His fingers tightened just slightly against his palm, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me, enough to tell me he heard me, that somewhere inside he was still there. I exhaled slowly, careful not to push, careful not to break whatever fragile thread had just appeared. I shifted my gaze downward, not staring at him, not demanding anything from him, just existing beside him, letting the room breathe again. And that was when I saw it more clearly, the way his feet pressed lightly against the floor, but never pushed, never tested, like the ground beneath him was not something he trusted, like it might disappear if he tried. I leaned back slightly, resting my hands on my knees, giving him space. You do not have to talk, I said gently. You do not have to do anything, my voice steady, calm. You can just sit with me. And for a long moment, nothing changed. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, but not empty anymore, not like before. And then, just barely, his eyes shifted, not toward me, not directly, but enough that I felt it, like, hey, door opening a fraction of an inch. And I knew right then, this was not about his legs. Not really. This was about something deeper, something that had taught him that moving was not safe, that stepping forward came with a cost he was not willing to pay. And as I sat there on that cold floor, in a house that did not belong to me, in a life that was not mine, I realized something I had not expected. This was not going to be about fixing him. It was going to be about convincing him that he was allowed to move again. I stayed on the floor longer than I planned, letting the silence do its work, because silence, when it is not forced, can be safer than words. And I could feel him adjusting to my presence in small ways that no one else in this house would notice. The way his breathing slowed just slightly, the way his shoulders were not as rigid as when I first walked in, and I knew if I pushed now, even a little, I would lose that fragile thread. So instead I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, pulling out a small folded cloth and a bottle of water. Nothing clinical, nothing that looked like treatment, just something simple, something human. I set them on the floor between us, not too close to him, not too far, just within reach if he chose to notice. Do you know something? I said quietly, my voice steady, not asking for a response, just offering a thought. Feet remember things. I glanced down at my own shoes, then back at his, bare against the floor. They remember where we stood, where we ran, where we stopped. I let the words sit there, not heavy, not dramatic, just present. And for a moment, nothing happened, but then his eyes shifted again, this time lower, not toward me, but toward the space between us, toward the cloth, toward the water. And that was enough. That was everything. I did not smile. I did not react. I just continued. Sometimes when something scares us, we stop trusting the ground. I tilted my head slightly, watching without staring. It is not because the ground changed. It is because we did. His fingers tightened again, more noticeable this time, his toes curling slightly. And I knew I was getting close to something real, something he had been holding on to for too long. I picked up the cloth slowly, dipping it into the water, wringing it out carefully so it would not drip, every movement visible, every motion predictable, safe. I'm not here to make you walk, I said softer now, almost a whisper. I am here to help you feel the ground again. The room felt different now, less like a museum, less like a place where time had stopped, and more like something waiting to happen, something holding its breath. I shifted forward just an inch, close enough that if he wanted to pull away, he could, giving him the choice, always the choice, because control was the one thing he had lost, and the one thing I needed to give back. Can I asked, my voice barely above the quiet hum of the room, not expecting an answer, not needing one, just asking because it mattered, because it always mattered, and for a second I thought nothing would happen, that I had reached the edge, and that was as far as he would let me go. But then, so small it almost broke me, his foot moved, not a step, not even close, just a shift, just enough that it was no longer pressed flat against the floor, just enough that it told me he was still in there. Still listening, still deciding. My chest tightened, but I kept my face calm. Steady, I leaned forward just a little more, placing the warm cloth gently against his foot, not gripping, not holding, just resting it there, letting the warmth speak before I did. And he flinched, not in fear, not exactly, but in recognition, like the sensation surprised him, like it had been too long since anything felt like this. I did not pull away. I did not press further. I just stayed, letting the moment stretch, letting him decide what came next. And that was when I felt it, not from him, but from the room behind me, a presence heavy, controlled, watching, and I knew without turning that we were no longer alone. I did not turn around right away because the moment mattered more than the man behind me, because if I broke this connection now, I might not get it back, and the warmth of the cloth was still resting against Luca's foot, his skin reacting in tiny ways, subtle, almost invisible, but real, and I kept my voice low, steady like nothing else existed. It is okay, I whispered, not to reassure him, but to remind him, you are allowed to feel this. His toes shifted again, a fraction more than before. Not pulling away, not freezing, just responding. And that was when I heard it, a slow, measured step behind me, the kind of step that did not rush, did not hesitate, a step that expected space to be made for it. I did not need to look to know who it was. The air in the room changed, heavier, sharper, like everything was being observed and calculated at once. But I did not stop. I could not stop. I gently moved the cloth across Luca's foot, careful, intentional, like every inch of contact had. Meaning sometimes, I said softly, the body forgets what it is safe to do. I paused just long enough for the words to settle. But it can remember, the silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It was full, charged, waiting. And then behind me, a voice low, controlled, precise. What are you doing? I closed my eyes for half a second, not in fear, but in focus, because I knew this voice, even though I had only heard it once. It was the same voice from the phone, the one that did not ask, the one that decided. I turned my head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without breaking my position. Adrian Volkov stood a few feet behind me, exactly where I'd felt him, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that looked like it belonged to him more than his own skin. His eyes were not on me. They were on his son, locked, unblinking, like he was afraid that if he looked away, something would disappear. I am not making him do anything, I said calmly, my voice steady despite the weight in the room. I am giving him a choice. Adrian did not respond immediately, and that silence told me more than any words could. He was not used to hearing that. Not in this house. Not in his world, where everything moved on command, where control was not questioned. I shifted my attention back to Luca, because he was the only one who mattered in this moment. I lifted the cloth slightly, then placed it back down, a gentle rhythm, predictable, safe. You can stop me, I told him softly, anytime you want. His fingers moved again, more clearly now, his hand pressing lightly against his leg, like he was grounding himself, like he was deciding something important. And then it happened, not dramatic, not sudden, just a small, undeniable movement. His foot lifted, barely an inch, but it was no longer resting on the floor, no. Longer anchored by whatever had been holding him in place for 3 years. My breath caught, but I did not react. I did not celebrate. I just stayed steady, because this was not the moment to break. This was the moment to hold behind me. I heard something shift, not a step, not movement, just a change, like the man who controlled everything had just lost control of one small thing and did not know how to take it back. Luca, Adrian said, his voice different now, quieter, not weaker, but uncertain, like he was stepping into something unfamiliar. Something he could not command. I glanced at him briefly, just long enough to see it, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand had tightened at his side, not in anger, but in something else, something closer to disbelief. And then I looked back at Luca, because he was still there, still choosing, still deciding, and I knew, in that exact moment, that this was only the beginning. The room did not move, but everything inside it shifted like gravity had quietly changed direction and no one knew how to stand anymore. Luca's foot was still lifted, just an inch, maybe less, but it was enough to prove that whatever had held him there for 3 years was not stronger than this moment. And I kept the cloth steady in my hand, not reaching, not pulling, just present. That is it. I said softly, not praise, not excitement, just recognition. You felt that his breathing changed, shallow at first, then deeper, like his body was catching up to something his mind had not yet fully accepted. And I watched carefully because this was where most people made the mistake. They pushed, they rushed. They turned a moment into a performance. But this was not a performance. This was trust. Fragile and easily broken. Behind me, Adrian had not moved, but I could feel him, the tension in him, the way he was holding everything back, every instinct that told him to step in, to take control, to demand more, and that restraint, that silence, told me more about him than anything else could. I lowered the cloth slowly, letting it rest against Luca's foot again, grounding him, anchoring him. You can put it down, I said gently, giving him permission to stop because stopping was just as important as moving. His foot hovered for a second longer, then lowered back to the floor, soft, controlled, intentional, not a collapse, not a retreat, but a choice. And I felt something loosen in my chest, something I'd not realized I was holding. I leaned back slightly, creating space again, letting the moment settle, letting it become real. That was yours, I added quietly. No one made you do that. His fingers relaxed just a little, not fully, not yet, but enough to tell me he understood. And then for the first time, his eyes moved higher, not past me, not through me, but toward me, not fully meeting mine, not yet, but close enough that I could see the shift, the awareness, the presence. And it hit me then, not like a realization, but like something I already knew finally becoming clear. He had not been gone. Not really. He had been waiting for something that felt safe enough to come back to. Behind me, Adrian took a step forward, slow, controlled, like he was entering a space he did not fully understand. And I turned my head just enough to see him from the corner of my eye. His expression was not what I expected. Not anger, not impatience, but something quieter, something heavier, like he was seeing his son for the first time in years and did not know what to do with that. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low, but no longer sharp, no longer demanding. I shook my head slightly, keeping my attention on Luca, because the answer was not for him. Not yet. I did not fix anything. I said simply, I listened. The word hung in the air, unfamiliar in a place like this, unfamiliar in a world built on control and command. And for a moment, no one spoke. The silence returned, but it was different now, not empty, not frozen, but alive, carrying something fragile and new. And I knew as I sat there on that cold floor with a damp cloth in my hand and a boy who had just taken the smallest step back into himself, that this was not the miracle people would talk about. Not yet. This was quieter than that, slower, harder to see, but it was real, and real was always enough. I did not stand up right away because standing would have changed the balance of the room, and right now everything depended on that balance, the quiet, the space, the fragile trust that had just begun to exist between us. So I stayed where I was, sitting on the floor, the damp cloth still in my hand, the water slowly cooling in the bowl beside me. And Luca's foot rested flat again, but not the same as before, not locked, not distant, just present. And that difference mattered more than anything dramatic, more than anything visible. I shifted my weight slightly, careful, controlled, making sure every movement still belonged to him. Not to me. We're not in a hurry, I said softly, not looking at Adrian, not inviting interruption, just speaking into the space that Luca now shared with me. You can take your time. His eyes flickered again, closer this time, not fully meeting mine, but no longer avoiding, like he was testing what it meant to be seen again. And I let that happen, without reacting, without turning it into something bigger than it was, because children like him did not need pressure. They needed consistency, something that did not change when they did. Behind me, Adrian moved again, slower now, more careful, like he was learning a language he had never needed before. I could hear it in the way his shoes no longer echoed as sharply against the floor, in the way his breathing was no longer perfectly controlled. And that told me everything I needed to know. He was not just watching anymore. He was feeling it, whether he wanted to or not. I reached for the cloth again, dipping it lightly into the water, then wringing it out, the same rhythm as before, predictable, steady, something Luca could follow without thinking. "I'm going to do it again," I said gently, giving him the warning, giving him the choice, and this time I did not ask for permission out loud. I waited, watching, listening, and for a moment nothing changed, but then his foot shifted just slightly forward, not away, not frozen, but forward, and that was his answer. My chest tightened, but I kept my face calm, my voice even. I placed the cloth against his foot again, the warmth returning, the contact familiar now, instead of foreign, and he did not flinch the same way. He reacted, yes, but differently, like his body was starting to remember something it had not trusted in a long time. "That is it," I murmured barely above a whisper. "You're still here." His fingers moved again, not tightening this time, but pressing into the fabric of his pants, grounding himself, holding on to something real. And then, slowly, carefully, his other foot shifted too, not lifting, not yet, but adjusting, aligning, like his body was preparing for something it had not allowed before. And I felt it again, that shift. In the room, not from Luca, but from Adrian, a sharp inhale, quickly controlled, but not quick enough to hide it completely. I glanced back for just a second, just enough to see his face. The composure was still there, the control, the authority, but underneath it, something else had cracked through, something raw, something human, something he could not command or suppress. And when our eyes met, it was not a warning, not a challenge. It was a question he did not know how to ask. I looked away. First, not out of fear, but because this was not about him, not yet. I turned back to Luca, lowering the cloth slowly, setting it beside the bowl, letting the moment breathe again. "You do not have to stand," I said softly, because that was the truth, because forcing the next step would undo everything we had just built. "But you can," the words hung there, simple, unforced, real. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I saw it clearly, not just in Luca, but in everything around us. This was no longer about whether he could walk. It was about whether he believed he was allowed to try. I did not move closer, and I did not move away, because the space between us had become the most important thing in the room. It was not empty anymore. It was filled with choice, with something Luca had not been given in a very long time. And I could see it now in the way his shoulders shifted. Not rigid like before, not collapsed, just adjusting, like he was learning where his body ended and the world began again. I kept my voice soft, steady, like a rhythm he could follow without thinking. "You do not have to prove anything," I said quietly, letting each word land without weight. "Not to me. Not to him. Not to anyone." I did not look back at Adrian when I said it, but I felt him, the stillness in him sharpening. Not in anger, but in recognition, because control had always been his language, and I was asking his son to speak something else entirely. Luca's fingers pressed more firmly into his legs now, grounding himself, and his eyes lifted just a little higher, closer to mine than before, not fully, not yet, but enough that I could see the question there, not in words, but in presence, in hesitation, in the quiet space between fear and decision. I nodded once, slow, almost imperceptible, not encouraging, not pushing, just acknowledging what was already happening. "You can try," I said, softer now, almost like a secret. "And if it does not work, nothing changes," because that was the truth, because fear often came from the belief that failure meant loss. And he needed to know that it did not, that this moment belonged to him, no matter what happened next. The silence deepened, but it was no longer heavy. It was focused, like the room itself was leaning in, waiting without demanding. And then I saw it, not all at once, not dramatic, just a shift. His hands moved from resting to pressing. His shoulders leaned forward, fraction, his weight adjusting in a way that suggested something new, something intentional. And I felt my own breath slow to match his, not consciously, just instinct, because this was not something you rushed. This was something you followed. And then his left foot pressed into the floor, not lifting yet, just testing, like he was asking a question he had not dared to ask in 3 years. And when nothing bad happened, when the ground did not disappear, when the room did not break his right, foot followed, a small adjustment, a quiet alignment. And I stayed still, completely still, because even the smallest movement from me could become pressure, could turn this into something external instead of something his behind me. Adrian shifted again. I heard it this time, a subtle step, closer than before, but still restrained, still controlled, like he was holding himself back with everything he had. And that restraint, that choice not to interfere, mattered more than anything he could have said. Luca, he spoke again, softer now, his voice no longer a command, but something else, something unfamiliar, something that carried weight without force. And Luca reacted, not by looking at him, not by freezing, but by pausing, considering, like he was hearing him differently now, like the voice that once controlled everything no longer held the same power. And that was when it happened. Not a full movement, not a step, but the beginning of one. His body leaned forward just enough that if he wanted to, if he chose to, he could rise. And the moment stretched, suspended between what had been and what could be, and I knew, without needing to say it, without needing to move, that everything from here on would come down to one thing, not strength, not ability, but belief. The moment did not break. It deepened, stretching longer than it should have, longer than most people could tolerate. But this was not a moment for most people. This was his, and Lucas stayed there, suspended between sitting and standing, between what he had been and what he might become, his body leaning forward just enough that the next move would change everything. And I did nothing, absolutely nothing, because anything I added would take something away from him, and I could feel Adrian behind me, closer now, not just physically but emotionally, like he had stepped into something he could not control and did not know how to leave. The air felt different, heavier but clearer, like something invisible had finally been acknowledged. "It is your choice," I said quietly, not as instruction, not as encouragement, but as truth, the only thing that mattered in this room. Luca's breathing shifted again, deeper now, more deliberate, like he was preparing, not reacting. His hands pressed harder against his legs, his shoulders tensed, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he pushed, not upward at first, just forward, testing, asking the ground one more time if it would hold him. And it did. It did not disappear. It did not betray him. It stayed exactly where it was, and that was enough. That was everything. His body followed, just a fraction more, his weight shifting in a way that had not happened in years. And I felt something rise in my chest. Not excitement, not relief, something steadier, something quieter, something that knew this mattered. More than any reaction I could give. Behind me, Adrian inhaled sharply, not loud, not uncontrolled, but enough that it cut through the silence. And for the first time, I heard something in him that had not been there before, not authority, not command, but uncertainty, real and unguarded. "Luca," he said again, but this time it was different, softer, almost like he was afraid the name itself might break something fragile. And Luca reacted, not by stopping, not by retreating, but by continuing, slowly, carefully, like he was learning how to move in a world that no longer felt the same. His feet pressed more firmly into the floor now, both of them, not just one, and his body lifted just enough that the line between sitting and standing blurred. And I could see it clearly now, the moment where fear and belief collided, where everything he had held onto for 3 years met something new, something uncertain but possible. I leaned back slightly, giving him more space, making sure there was nothing in front of him, nothing to catch him, nothing to support him, because this had to be his, completely his, and the room held its breath, every inch of it, every person in it. Even the walls seemed to wait. And then, in a movement so small it could have been missed by anyone who was not looking, he rose. Not fully, not steady, but undeniably, unmistakably, his body lifted off the chair, his legs holding, not perfectly, not strongly, but enough to prove that they could, and the world did not change. The room did not collapse. Nothing dramatic happened, except everything, because Adrian froze completely, like the concept of control had just slipped through his fingers, and he did not know how to reach for it again. I did not speak. I did not move. I just watched Luca, because this was not the moment to celebrate. This was the moment to let him feel it, to let him understand that this was real, that this belonged to him. And in that quiet, suspended second, I knew something with absolute certainty. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. For a second, nothing moved, not him, not me, not even the air, like the entire world had paused just to see if this was real, if it would hold. And Lucas stood there, not straight, not steady, but standing, his knees slightly bent, his balance uncertain, his body trembling in a way that was not weakness but effort, raw and unfiltered. And I stayed exactly where I was, still on the floor, lower than him now, making sure he did not feel watched from above. making sure this moment remained his. And his alone, his eyes shifted downward, not in fear, not in avoidance, but in awareness, like he was seeing his own feet for the first time, like he was recognizing something that had always been there, but had never felt safe enough to trust. And his breath came a little faster now. Not panic, not distress, just unfamiliar, like his body was trying to catch up to what it was doing behind me. Adrian did not speak. And that silence was louder than anything else, because a man like him did not stay. Quiet unless something had taken the words away. I could feel it, the way he was holding himself back, the way every instinct in him was probably telling him to step forward, to catch, to stabilize, to take control of the moment. But he did not. He stayed where he was, and that choice, that restraint, was the only reason this moment continued to exist. "You are okay," I said softly, not to reassure him, but to anchor him. "You're still in control." Luca's fingers loosened at his sides, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, just there. And then, slowly, carefully, he shifted his weight. Not much, just enough that one foot pressed more firmly into the ground than the other. And the second that happened, his body reacted, a slight sway, a subtle loss of balance, and I felt it, the instinct to reach out, to steady him, to make sure he did not fall. But I did not move. I could not move, because if I did, I would take this from him. I would turn it into something external instead of something he owned. And for a split second, the room tightened, the possibility of losing the moment hovering just beneath the surface. But Luca did something unexpected, something small but powerful. He adjusted, just a fraction, his other foot pressing down, correcting, responding, and the sway stopped. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to show that he could, that he was learning in real time, that his body remembered more than his fear allowed. And that was when Adrian exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow release of something he had been holding for years. And I heard it, I felt it, the shift in him, the crack in something that had always seemed unbreakable. How? He started, his voice low, almost rough, but the word did not finish because there was no answer he could accept yet, no explanation that would fit into the world he understood. I finally lifted myself. Slightly, not standing, just enough to meet Luca's level without towering over him. My movement still slow, still predictable. "That is enough," I said gently, because pushing further would turn this into something else, something forced. And he did not need that. He needed to leave this moment whole, complete. His Luca's eyes lifted just a little, not fully to me, not fully to anyone, but enough that I could see the change, the presence, the awareness, and, for the first time, I saw something new there. Not fear, not emptiness, but curiosity, quiet and fragile. And as he stood there, not perfectly, not confidently, but truly standing, I realized something that had nothing to do with his legs, nothing to do with movement at all. This was not about learning how to walk. Again, this was about learning that he had never been broken in the first place. He was still standing when the moment began to settle into something real. Not a surprise anymore, not an accident, but a state his body was learning to hold. And I could see the difference now in the way his shoulders adjusted. Not bracing, not locking, but balancing, like he was discovering where he existed in space again. And I stayed close to the floor, still lower than him. Still careful not to turn this into something that belonged to anyone else. "Breathe," I said softly, not as instruction, but as reminder. And he did, not perfectly, not evenly, but intentionally, his chest rising a little deeper, a little more controlled. And with each breath, the tension in his body shifted, not disappearing, but changing, becoming something he could work with instead of something that controlled him. Behind me, Adrian finally moved one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate. Like every movement had to be chosen instead of assumed. And when I glanced back, I saw it clearly. The man who had walked into this room with absolute control was gone. Or at least, not the only version of him left. Something else had surfaced, something quieter, something that did not know how to command what it was seeing. He stopped a few feet away from Luca, not reaching, not touching, just standing there, watching like he was afraid that even his presence might break it. "You can sit if you want," I said gently, turning my attention back to Luca, giving him an exit, giving him safety, because staying was a choice, but so was stopping, and both mattered. Luca's eyes shifted again, this time not downward, not inward, but outward, toward the space in front of him. And for the first time, he seemed to consider more than just holding himself up. He seemed to consider movement, Not fully, not clearly, but enough that I could see the thought forming, the possibility existing, and his weight shifted again, subtle, careful. One foot pressing just slightly ahead of the other. Not a step. Not yet, but the beginning of one. And the room reacted without sound. The air tightening just enough that you could feel it, like everything was leaning forward, waiting to see if he would continue. And I did not speak. I did not interrupt, because this was not a moment for words. This was a moment for trust, and Luca hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to feel the edge of fear, the memory of everything that had kept him still for so long. And then, slowly, carefully, he moved, not far, not fully, but enough, his foot sliding forward an inch, maybe two, just enough that it was no longer where it had been, just enough that it counted, and his body followed, adjusting, correcting, holding, and it was not perfect, it was not steady, but it was real, and behind me, Adrian's breath caught again, sharper this time, like he had just witnessed something he had not allowed himself to believe was possible. That is it, I said quietly, not loud enough to take the moment away, just enough to anchor it. You are doing it. And Luca did not look at me, he did not look at anyone, but he did not stop either. He held himself there, in that small, fragile shift forward, like he was testing not just his body, but the world itself. And for the first time, the space around him did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something he could enter 1 inch at a time. And I realized then, as I watched him stand there between what had been and what was becoming, that this was not about reaching a destination, not about walking across a room or proving something to anyone. This was about reclaiming something that had always been his, something no one had taken, only something he had learned to hide. And now, slowly, quietly, he was learning how to bring it back. He did not fall. And that was the first thing that mattered, not the step, not the distance, just the fact that he remained standing after choosing to move. And I watched carefully as his body adjusted again. The small tremor in his legs shifting into something more controlled. Not stable yet, but learning, adapting, responding in real time. And I could see it in his posture, in the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, in the way his head tilted forward as if he was trying to understand what his body was doing. And I stayed where I was, grounded, still, making sure there was no pressure in the space. No expectation, just presence. You can stop any time. I said softly because he needed to know that this was not a test, that nothing would be taken away if he chose to sit. And for a moment, it looked like he might, his weight shifting backward just slightly, his knees bending a fraction, but then something changed, something small, but undeniable. He corrected himself again, pressing his feet more firmly into the floor, holding himself upright, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that choice was everything. Behind me, Adrian took another step forward, closer now than before, close enough that I could feel the heat of his presence. The tension in him no longer sharp, but heavy, like something inside him was being pulled in two directions at once. And when he spoke, his voice was different again, quieter, rougher, like it had been worn down by something he could not control. How long? He started, then stopped, the question unfinished because the answer did not matter, because time was not what had been missing here. I turned my head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without breaking the moment. He is not late, I said simply, my voice steady, certain he is right on time, and the words settled into the room in a way nothing else had. Not dramatic, not forceful, just true. And Adrian did not respond, but I felt it, the way something in him shifted, not fully, not completely, but enough to let the moment continue without interference. I turned back to Luca, who was still standing, still holding himself in that fragile space between effort and belief, and his eyes lifted again, higher this time, not just toward me, but past me, toward the space where his father stood, and for a second, everything stilled again, not like before, not frozen, but focused like something important was about to happen, and Adrian did not move, did not reach, did not speak. He just stood there, letting himself be seen, maybe for the first time in a way that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with control, just presence. And Luca reacted, not dramatically, not emotionally, just a shift, a subtle adjustment in his stance, like he was recognizing something, not the man his father had been, but the one standing in front of him now. And I felt it, the connection forming, fragile but real, something that had not existed before this moment. And I lowered my voice even further, almost a whisper now. You can take another step if you want, not a command, not an expectation, just an option. And Luca did not move right away. He stayed where he was processing, feeling, deciding, and then slowly, carefully, he shifted again, his foot moving forward just a little more than before, not far, not steady, but enough to show that he was not just standing anymore. He was choosing to move through the space in front of him. And as he did, I saw it clearly, not just in him, but in Adrian as well. Something breaking, not violently, not suddenly, but quietly, like a wall that had been there for years, finally beginning to crack. And for the first time since I walked into that house, I understood something that had nothing to do with therapy, nothing to do with technique. This was not just about helping a child walk again. This was about teaching a man how to let go. The second step did not look like much to anyone who did not understand what they were seeing. Just a small shift forward, a few inches at most, uneven, careful, uncertain. But to me it was everything, because it was no longer about whether he could. It was about whether he would continue. And Lucas stayed there after the movement, holding himself again in that fragile balance, his body adjusting, learning how to exist in motion instead of stillness. And I watched the way his breathing changed. Deeper now, more controlled, like he was beginning to trust the rhythm of his own body again. That is enough for today, I said softly, not because he cannot do more, but because he should not, because stopping at the right moment mattered more than pushing too far. His head tilted slightly, just a fraction, like he heard me, like he understood that this was not an ending but a pause. And slowly, carefully, he lowered himself back down, not collapsing, not giving in, but choosing to sit. His legs bending under him in a way that was no longer locked, no longer distant, just part of him again. And when he settled into the chair, something in the room exhaled, not loudly, not all at once, but enough that the tension that had been holding everything together softened into something quieter, something real. I placed the cloth back into the bowl, the water now cool, the surface still, like the moment had been absorbed into it. I wiped my hands slowly, not rushing, letting everything return to a pace that made sense again. Behind me, Adrian had not moved, not since the last step. And when I finally stood, slowly, carefully, making sure not to disrupt the space that had just been created, I turned to face him fully for the first time. And what I saw was not the man who had called me, not the one who had stood at the door with quiet authority. This was someone else, someone who had just witnessed something he could not control, something he could not buy, something he could not command into existence. And it had changed him, even if only slightly, even if only for this moment. He will walk, I said, not as a promise, not as a guarantee, but as a truth that had already begun. Adrian's eyes moved from me to Luca, then back again, searching, not for doubt, not for proof, but for something he could hold on to, something he could understand. You are sure, he said quietly, not demanding, not challenging, just asking in a way that felt unfamiliar for him. And I nodded once, steady, certain. I'm not the one who decides that. I answered, my voice calm, grounded. He is. The words settled between us, simple, undeniable, and Adrian did not respond right away. But I saw it, the way his jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in acceptance, like he was beginning to understand something he had never needed to before, that control was not always strength. And that letting go was not always loss. I turned back to Luca one more time. And this time his eyes met mine, not briefly, not uncertainly, but fully clear and present. And there was something there now that had not been before, not just awareness, not just curiosity, but something stronger, something quieter, something that did not need words to exist. And I gave him a small nod, not encouragement, not instruction, just acknowledgement, because this had never been about what I could do for him. It had always been about what he was ready to do for himself. And as I stepped back, creating space once more, I realized that the most important part of this moment was not the steps he had taken, but the ones he now believed he could take next. The room did not return to what it had been, and I knew it never would. Not after this, not after something so quiet had changed everything. Lucas sat there now, his feet still resting on the floor, but no longer distant from it, no longer disconnected, just there, part of him, and his posture was different. Not in a dramatic way, not something anyone would notice from across the room, but in the small things. The way his shoulders were no longer held in that subtle tension, the way his hands rested more naturally at his sides instead of gripping. And most of all, the way his eyes stayed present. Not drifting away, not retreating, but staying here in this moment, in this space, and I let the silence settle one last time. Not heavy, not uncertain, just complete, like the room itself understood that something had ended and something else had begun. I reached down and picked up my bag slowly, not rushing, not breaking the rhythm that had been created, and when I stood, I did it, carefully making sure my movement did not pull attention away from Luca, because this was still his moment. Even as it closed, I turned toward the door, not to leave yet, just to shift the space, to signal that we were moving forward, not ending. And that was when I heard it, so soft it could have been missed, so quiet it barely existed. Wait, the word stopped me before I even realized I had heard it. My hand froze on the strap of my bag, my breath catching in a way I could not control. Because I knew that voice, even though I had never heard it before, I turned slowly, not sudden, not sharp, just enough to meet the source of it. And Luca was looking at me, directly now, not past me, not through me, but at me, fully present, fully here, and his lips parted just slightly, like the word had surprised even him, like it had been waiting somewhere inside him for a long time, and had finally found a way. Out! And for a second, no one moved, not me, not Adrian, not even the air, because this was something new, something no one in this room had expected, and I felt it again, that quiet certainty, that understanding that this was never about one moment, never about one step. This was about everything that followed. I gave him a small nod, gentle, steady. "I'm not going anywhere," I said softly, not a promise I could guarantee, but one he needed to hear, and his eyes did not leave mine. Not this time, not like before, and behind me, I heard Adrian move, not closer, not interfering, just a shift, like he was adjusting to a world where he did not have to control every outcome. And when I glanced at him, just briefly, I saw it. Not the power, not the authority, but something else entirely, something quieter, something almost unrecognizable on a man like him. Gratitude, not spoken, not shown in any obvious way, but there, in the way his posture had softened just slightly, in the way his eyes no longer held that constant calculation. And I realized then, as I stood between them, that this had never been about fixing what was broken. It had been about reminding them both of something they had forgotten, that control could not create trust, that power could not replace presence, and that sometimes the smallest act, something as simple as touch, as simple as patience, could do what nothing else could. I adjusted the strap of my bag and took one step back, giving them space, not leaving, just stepping out of the center, because this was no longer my moment. It was theirs, and as the silence settled again, softer now, warmer, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. He did not need me to make him walk. He only needed someone to show him that he already could.